My son was airlifted off a hiking trail. While he fought for his life, my mother-in-law texted, "Missed the birthday dinner and you're dead to us." 3 days later, Reed opened his eyes and whispered something about his mother that made my blood run cold. My name is Dale Harmon. I'm 43 years old, and I work as a construction superintendent in Columbus, Ohio. 20 years of reading blueprints, managing crews, making sure structures don't fail before someone gets hurt. I'm trained to catch problems early. The biggest problem I ever missed was happening right inside my own home, one slow day at a time. I married Renee Stanton 11 years ago. She was 26, I was 32, and I genuinely believed we were building something real together. What I didn't fully account for was her mother, Vera Stanton, 64 years old, sharp-tongued, and absolutely convinced she held a permanent seat at every table in our marriage. Her husband Howard just nodded along to whatever Vera decided. I told myself it was manageable. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, and that was near the top of the list. Our son Reed is 12. Bright kid, obsessed with history, can recite Civil War battle dates like other kids recite sports stats. But starting roughly 2 years ago, Reed kept getting sick in ways that didn't quite make sense. Stomach aches that came and went. Fatigue that lingered for days. Occasional dizziness bad enough to make him grab a wall. Renee took him to doctor after doctor. I noticed, without thinking much about it, that she never stayed with one practice for long. When I finally sat down and counted, it was 7 different pediatricians over 3 years. Every time one of them started digging deeper, she'd quietly move on to someone new. I told myself she was just being a thorough mother. I should have asked harder questions a long time before I did. That October, Reed and I headed down to Hocking Hill State Park for our fall camping weekend, a tradition we kept since he was 7 years old. Those trips were ours. No phones, no schedules, just the two of us on a trail somewhere. Renee had never shown much interest in packing for those trips before, but that year she insisted on doing Reed's bag herself. She also sent along a thermos of hot cocoa, said it was Reed's idea. Reed gave me a puzzled look when she said that, but didn't argue. It was cold out and the cocoa was there, so he drank it. We were about 2 hours into a ridge trail when Reed stopped walking and told me the trees were spinning. I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. His legs gave out and he went down a rocky embankment off the side of the path, maybe 12 feet. Not a catastrophic drop. Enough. I was down there before I finished thinking about it. He was breathing, eyes open, but couldn't tell me what day it was or where we were. I called 911, kept my hand on his chest, and talked to him about nothing in particular. The trail, the weather, a football game I barely remembered, for 31 minutes until the helicopter broke through the cloud cover above the tree line and found us. Grant Medical Center, Columbus. I drove 90 the whole way. By the time I parked and got through the doors, Reed was already past the ER, and I was just a man in a waiting room who couldn't do a single useful thing except sit in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and try to remember how to breathe. Then my phone buzzed. Text from Vera Stanton. Renee's birthday dinner is tomorrow. Don't you dare miss it. I stared at the screen long enough to read it 3 times. Then I typed, Reed might not make it through the night. Her reply came back fast. Be there, or you're dead to us. I blocked her number without responding, set the phone face down on the chair beside me, and sat there in that quiet, humming waiting room understanding, maybe for the first time with real clarity, exactly what kind of family I had married into, and what it had cost me not to see it sooner. Reed made it through surgery. The doctor, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Paulson, came out around 2 in the morning and told me he had a mild concussion, 2 bruised ribs, and some soft tissue damage to his left shoulder. Nothing broken. No internal bleeding. She said he was stable, sedated, and that I could see him in the morning. I thanked her and went back to my chair. Didn't sleep. Watched the waiting room empty out and fill back up as the hours moved. At 7:30 the next morning, Dr. Paulson found me again, this time with a different expression. She pulled a second chair close and sat down, which told me before she said anything that this wasn't a routine check-in. Mr. Harmon, she said, I've been looking over Reed's medical history. The records your wife authorized us to go back about 2 years. 14 separate visits across 7 different practices. Gastrointestinal complaints, recurring fatigue, 2 episodes of acute dizziness. She paused. The pattern is unusual, especially given that his blood work and imaging from yesterday Both came back essentially normal. I kept my voice level. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that I'm a mandatory reporter, she said, and that I've already filed a report with Franklin County Child Protective Services. That's not an accusation, Mr. Harmon. It's a procedure. But I need to ask, do you have any explanation for why a healthy 12-year-old has been in and out of medical offices for 2 years without a single confirmed diagnosis? I didn't answer right away. I sat with that question and let it settle into everything I already knew but hadn't said out loud yet. 7 pediatricians. Renee always handling the appointments alone. Reed sick at home and perfectly fine on our camping trips until this one. No, I said finally. But I'm starting to. Dr. Paulson nodded slowly. CPS will be in contact with both parents. In the meantime, Reed stays here until we're satisfied he's medically stable, and until we understand what we're actually dealing with. I called Hank Lester from the hospital cafeteria while Reed was still sleeping. Hank was my oldest friend. We'd worked construction crews together in our 20s before he went back to school and became an attorney. Criminal defense, mostly, with a background in family law that I'd never imagined needing. He picked up on the second ring. I laid out everything. The camping trip, the thermos, the fall, what Dr. Paulson had just told me. Hank listened without interrupting, which meant he was taking it seriously. Stay at the hospital, he said when I finished. Don't talk to CPS without me present. Don't talk to Renee about any of this yet. She's been calling since last night. I know. Let her call. His voice was steady and deliberate. Dale, if what you're describing is what it looks like, you're going to need to be very careful about every move you make from this point forward. Do you understand me? Yeah, I said. I understand. Good. I'll be there in 2 hours. I hung up and sat at that cafeteria table for a long time, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Somewhere above me, my son was waking up in a hospital bed, and somewhere across town, my wife was calling a number I wasn't picking up. For the first time in 11 years of marriage, that felt like exactly the right call. Reed was awake when I walked in on the 3rd day. Pale, a little swollen around the left eye from the fall, oxygen monitor clipped to his finger, but awake and watching the door like he'd been waiting. That alone told me something. Reed was the kind of kid who filled silences. The fact that he was just lying there, quiet, meant whatever was sitting inside him was heavier than his usual self could carry. I pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down, put my hand over his and didn't say anything. Sometimes you have to give a person room before they can speak. Dad. His voice was rough, still abraded from the breathing tube they'd had an overnight. I need to tell you something. About 2 nights before we left for the trip. Take your time. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, organizing his thoughts the way he always did before saying something important. Then he came back to me. I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs to get some water. The light over the stove was on in the kitchen. Mom and Grandma Vera were sitting at the table talking. They didn't hear me on the stairs. I kept my face neutral and my hands still. Grandma was talking about you, about how you were always at job sites, how you control the finances, how Mom deserved better. Reed paused, and then she said that if something happened to me on the camping trip, if it looked like an accident, that the family would finally have some breathing room. She talked about insurance policies. She said boys fall all the time on hiking trails, and no one asks too many questions. The room felt like the air had been drained out of it. Mom didn't agree. Reed added, his voice careful. But she didn't tell Grandma to stop, either. She just kept crying, and Grandma kept talking like she was planning a grocery run. He looked at me with eyes that were too old for his face. I went back to my room and lay in the dark for hours. And then the next day, Mom packed my bag herself, made the cocoa, stood right there in the kitchen, and watched me drink the whole thermos before we left. Did it taste normal? No. Bitter. Like medicine. I almost said something, but I didn't want to hurt her feelings. He let out a short, humorless breath. Dumb, right? Not dumb, I said firmly. None of this is on you. You understand me? Not a single part of it. He nodded, but I could tell he was still carrying something. 12-year-olds don't shed weight that fast. I squeezed his hand once, stood up, and walked into the corridor. Called Hank Lester. He picked up on the second ring, and I told him everything Reed had just said, word for word, keeping my voice low and steady against the hallway noise. Hank was quiet for a few seconds after I finished. Dale, the thermos, where is it right now? In the bed of my truck. I threw everything in the back when I followed the helicopter and haven't touched it since. Do not touch it. I'm calling a private lab contact in the next 10 minutes. We're not waiting on county processing. His voice was clipped and precise. I'm also going to request the hospital's child advocacy team conduct a formal recorded interview with Reed today, before Renee or Vera gets anywhere near that room. That statement needs to be documented by a professional, on video, before anyone has a chance to influence it. Renee's been texting since last night asking when she can come in. She waits, Hank said flatly. Get back in that room and stay with your son. I'll be there in 90 minutes. I went back in and sat beside Reed for the rest of that morning. Ms. Ellison from the child advocacy team arrived just after noon, composed, experienced, the kind of person who put kids at ease without making it obvious she was trying to. She conducted Reed's interview in a separate room while Hank observed. I stood in the hallway outside and listened to the silence and understood that the life I'd been living for the past 11 years was over. What came next depended entirely on what I did in the hours and days ahead. I intended to get every single one of them right. Hank came out of the observation room with the look of a man who'd just heard something he couldn't unhear. He found me in the corridor, hands in my jacket pockets, and said 4 words before anything else. It's clean and solid. We drove to his office that evening. His conference table was covered in legal pads and printed case precedents before we even sat down, which told me he'd been working since our phone call. He poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one toward me, and didn't waste any time. I'm going to tell you something you need to hear before we talk strategy, Hank said. Family court in this state statistically favors mothers in initial custody and medical authority determinations. Not because every judge is biased, because the system was built on a framework that's 30 years past its expiration date, and default assumptions run deep. You're going to walk into that courtroom as the father, and you'll have to prove things that Renee will never once be asked to prove, simply because of who you are in relation to that child. I looked at him across the table. So we over-prepare. We over-prepare, he agreed. Reed's recorded statement is the foundation. The thermos goes to the lab tonight. I already made the call. I want those results in our hands within 48 hours. He made a note. Tomorrow morning, I'm filing an emergency motion for temporary sole medical authority. Renee is not to schedule, authorize, or attend any medical appointment for Reed until the court rules otherwise. She'll fight that. Let her fight it. Fighting in an open court is actually useful to us. Hank leaned forward. Here's what I need from you, Dale. Calm. Deliberate. Every time you walk into a courthouse or sit across from a caseworker, you're being evaluated, whether they say so or not. The second you show anger, Renee's attorney puts that in front of the judge, and suddenly the story isn't about what happened to Reed. It's about your temperament. Do you follow me? I've managed job sites through cave-ins, budget collapses, and crew walkouts, I said. I know how to hold it together when everything's going sideways. Use that, Hank said simply. We were in front of Judge Aldrich by 9 the next morning. She was in her late 60s, silver-haired, and ran her courtroom like she ran it, briskly, without patience for theater. Renee had retained an attorney named Fowler, polished and practiced, who argued that Reed's statement was the account of a concussed minor on pain medication, and that removing maternal medical authority was a drastic overreach based on nothing more than a frightened child's recollection during a traumatic hospitalization. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my hands flat on the surface and let Hank work. He walked Judge Aldrich through the documented record. 7 pediatric practices over 3 years, 14 appointments with 0 confirmed diagnoses, a pattern of symptom onset consistently correlating with time spent at home, the child advocacy interview conducted under proper protocol, and the preliminary lab findings on the thermos, sedative compounds detected, full analysis pending. That last item hit the room like a 2x4. Fowler objected on procedural grounds. Judge Aldrich overruled him without looking up from the page. She read in silence for 3 minutes. Then she set the documents down and looked at both tables. Temporary sole medical authority is granted to Mr. Harmon, effective immediately. I'm appointing a guardian ad litem for the minor child by end of week, someone whose only client is that boy. She looked at Fowler. Your client retains standard visitation rights pending the full hearing. Supervised. Location be approved by the GAL. She picked up her gavel. We're adjourned. I walked out of that courthouse into the cold October morning and stood on the sidewalk. Hank fell in beside me. 1 round down, he said. How many left? He thought about it honestly. Enough. But today you took the one that sets the table for everything else. I nodded, looked down the street at nothing in particular, thought about Reed in that hospital bed, waiting for me to come back. I went back. Reed had been in the hospital for 5 days when the nurses finally let him sit up properly and eat something that wasn't broth. I brought him a cheeseburger from the place 2 blocks down, his request, very specific, and sat across from him while he ate and tried to look like a normal father having a normal lunch with his kid. It was the best acting job I'd ever done. That evening, while Reed slept, I went down to my truck in the hospital parking garage. I needed his school backpack. He'd asked for his history book and a notebook, and I hadn't touched anything in the truck bed since the night of the accident. I pulled the backpack out from behind the passenger seat and set it on the hood. That's when I saw the iPad. Reed's school iPad had slid halfway under the seat, still in its case. I almost left it. Then I remembered something Reed had mentioned once, offhand, about using the voice memo app to record himself studying. Said hearing the material out loud helped it stick. I picked up the iPad and woke the screen. There was an active recording in the voice memo app. Date stamped the night before we left for Hocking Hills. Runtime, 41 minutes. I sat in that parking garage for a long time before I pressed play. The first few minutes were ambient, house sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, distant television. Then voices. Renee and Vera, clear enough to follow once you adjusted to the recording quality. Reed must have set the iPad on his desk near the floor vent without realizing the app was running. I listened to the whole thing. It was worse than what Reed had described. Not because Vera said anything Reed hadn't told me, but because of how she said it. Methodical, logical, running through contingencies like a project manager reviewing a timeline. She talked about the insurance policies by their payout amounts. She talked about how a father taking a boy hiking in October was statistically unremarkable. She talked about grief as a variable, how a grieving husband was unlikely to think clearly about finances for months afterward. Renee cried through most of it, but she didn't leave the table. I called Hank from the garage. He answered in 2 rings. I've got a recording, I said. 41 minutes. Both of them. On Reed's school iPad. Hank was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Don't touch anything else on that device. Bring it to my office tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. I was there by 8. Hank had his paralegal present and a digital forensics contact on the phone before I'd even set the iPad on the table. Within an hour, the recording had been forensically extracted, time-stamped, and duplicated across 3 secure locations. Hank's paralegal, a young woman named Deb, had gone pale by the midpoint of playback. Hank himself sat very still with his hands folded and listened to the entire thing without moving. When it finished, he looked at me. This changes the shape of everything. I know, it doesn't replace the court process, he said carefully. But as leverage, as a tool to ensure Renee's attorney understands exactly what their client is facing, this is significant. He leaned forward. I'm also reaching out to Ruth Tanner tomorrow morning. Who's Ruth Tanner? Private investigator. Former county sheriff's detective. She's handled 3 FDA cases that I know of. Children being kept medically dependent by a parent for attention and financial benefit. She knows how these cases work from the inside. If there are financial irregularities we haven't found yet, Ruth will find them. I drove back to the hospital that night and sat in Reed's room in the dark, watching him sleep. The recording was secured. The thermos results were due back in 24 hours. The wheels were moving. For the first time since that hillside, I felt like I was ahead of something instead of behind it. The lab results came back on a Thursday. Sedative compound confirmed. A prescription-strength sleep aid, concentrated well above therapeutic dosage, dissolved in the cocoa mixture. The kind of dose that would hit a 12-year-old on a hiking trail at elevation like a hammer. Hank filed the results with the court the same afternoon. Judge Aldrich's clerk called within 2 hours to schedule an emergency status hearing for the following Monday. Fowler, Renee's attorney, went quiet for the better part of a day before calling Hank to ask, very carefully, very indirectly, whether a negotiated resolution might be on the table. Hank told him we'd be in touch. Ruth Tanner arrived at Hank's office on Friday morning. She was 44, compact, with the kind of steady attention in her eyes that came from years of watching people closely for a living. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Tell me about the medical history, she said, opening a notepad. All of it, from the beginning. I walked her through everything. The 7 practices, the the 14 appointments, the pattern of Reed being sick at home and well everywhere else. She took notes without interrupting, and when I finished, she set her pen down. "This is a textbook FDA pattern," she said. "Factitious disorder imposed on another. A caregiver manufacturing or exaggerating illness in a child to generate attention, sympathy, or in cases like this, financial positioning. The rotation through multiple practices is classic. You move before any one doctor can establish a longitudinal view." "Can you prove the financial angle?" Hank asked. "Give me access to whatever financial records you have in 72 hours, Ruth said. What happened next came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Howard Stanton, Vera's husband, my father-in-law, 67 years old, called my cell phone on Saturday morning. I almost didn't answer. We'd barely spoken in years. Howard existed at the margins of every family event, quiet, present, unremarkable. I'd always figured he was simply a man who'd chosen peace over engagement. I was wrong about that too. "Dale." His voice was steady but careful. "I need to meet with you. Not at the house. Not anywhere Vera might be." We met at a diner 20 minutes from his neighborhood. Howard arrived first, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and a manila envelope on the table in front of him. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. Not just tired, hollowed out, like a man who'd been holding something heavy for a very long time and had finally decided to set it down. He slid the envelope across the table. "I've been keeping this for 4 years, he said. "Every time I told myself it wasn't my place. That was family business. That things would work themselves out." He looked at his coffee cup. "Reed almost died on that hillside. That ended my ability to stay quiet." Inside the envelope, bank statements going back 3 years. Credit card records. Correspondence between Vera and an insurance broker that Howard had printed from her laptop without her knowing. And a handwritten log. Howard's own handwriting, dated entries, documenting conversations he'd overheard between Vera and Renee going back nearly 2 years. Discussions about Reed's medical visits, about the policies, about timelines. I looked up at him across the table. "Howard, why didn't you?" "Because she's my wife," he said simply, and I kept believing she wouldn't actually go through with it. He met my eyes. "I was wrong. I won't be wrong again." I called Ruth Tanner from the diner parking lot before I'd even started the engine. Told her I had 4 years of documented financial records and a first-hand witness. She was quiet for a beat. Then, "Give me that envelope today." Howard Stanton went home to a woman who didn't know he'd just dismantled everything she'd built. And I drove back toward the hospital understanding that the ground had shifted completely, and that this time, it had shifted in our direction. Ruth Tanner worked fast. She showed up at Hank's office Monday morning with a laptop, Howard's folder, and a legal pad already half filled with notes, and by Wednesday afternoon, she had built a financial picture that made Hank's paralegal leave the room for 5 minutes just to collect herself. Ruth spread the documents across the conference table and walked me through it the same way I imagined she'd once briefed sheriff's detectives, methodically, without editorial, just fact after fact laid down like bricks. "Your wife has been maintaining a secondary checking account in her name only for approximately 3 years, Ruth began. "Deposits come from 3 sources. First, small transfers from your joint account, always under $800, always categorized as household expenses. Second, reimbursements from Reed's medical insurance claims, routed directly to her account rather than back to the joint account where the original payments came from. Third," she paused and slid a printed statement toward me, "a recurring transfer from a business account registered to Vera Stanton." I stared at the page. Vera has been paying Renee directly, monthly, for 26 months. The amounts vary, anywhere from $400 to $1,200, but the pattern is consistent. Ruth tapped the page. "When you add the total across all 3 sources over 3 years, you're looking at somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 that moved outside your awareness." I sat back in my chair and let that number land. "There's more," Ruth said. She pulled out the insurance correspondence Howard had photographed from Vera's desk. "These emails go back 18 months. Vera was in contact with an insurance broker, not your carrier, a separate broker, exploring the terms of Reed's policy. Specifically, the accidental death clause. Specifically, what documentation would be required for a claim filed by a surviving parent." Hank, who had been quiet through most of this, leaned forward. That's premeditation evidence. That's not a divorce case anymore. That's what I call it, Ruth said evenly. I thought about Reed in his hospital room, eating a cheeseburger, asking me to bring his history textbook. 12 years old and completely unaware that his grandmother had been researching the paperwork requirements for his death. I kept my voice flat. What do we do with this? Ruth looked at me. I've already been in contact with a detective at the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Former colleague of mine. I walked him through the framework, the lab results, the recording, the financial pattern, Howard's documented timeline. He's taking it to his supervisor today. She folded her hands on the table. This is no longer just a custody case, Dale. This is a criminal matter, and the prosecutor's office is going to want to move on it. Hank stood and walked to the window, which changes our divorce strategy significantly. When criminal charges are filed against Renee, and I believe they will be, her attorney's leverage evaporates. The negotiation dynamic shifts completely. When does that happen? I asked. Could be days, Ruth said. The recording and the lab results together are enough for an arrest warrant application. The financial records and Howard's testimony make it airtight. I drove back to the hospital that evening and sat with Reed through dinner. He'd started physical therapy that afternoon for his shoulder and was complaining about it with the particular enthusiasm of a kid who was feeling well enough to complain. I let him talk and ate bad cafeteria food and watched him and thought about how close I had come to sitting in this same hospital in entirely different circumstances. That night, alone in the parking garage, I called Howard Stanton. He answered on the first ring. The prosecutor's office is going to want your testimony, I told him. Formally. On record. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I've been ready for that since Saturday. I believed him. The criminal investigation moved faster than I expected. By Thursday of that week, Hank informed me that the Franklin County prosecutor had formally opened a case. Renee had been notified through her attorney. The arrest warrant for Vera was in process. Fowler, Renee's attorney, called Hank that same afternoon, and this time the tone was different. No more procedural maneuvering. No more confused child arguments. Just a man trying to figure out how much damage his client could still limit. But before that conversation could go anywhere useful, something else landed on my desk that I hadn't anticipated. Reed School, Westfield Middle, had a student support counselor named Mr. Briggs. He'd been Reed's counselor for 2 years. Quiet man, mid-40s, the kind of person who blended into the background of parent-teacher nights and never said much. I'd met him twice. Hadn't thought much about him either time. He called my cell phone on a Friday morning while I was driving to Hank's office. Mr. Harmon, he said, I've been following the news about Reed's situation. I want to be upfront with you. I owe you a conversation I should have initiated a long time ago. I pulled into a parking lot and stopped the car. I'm listening. Mr. Briggs explained that over the past 18 months, Reed had come to his office on 4 separate occasions. Twice asking general questions about what happened when parents didn't take care of their kids properly, once asking whether a counselor had to tell parents everything a student said, and once about 8 months ago, saying directly that he didn't feel safe at home, but immediately taking it back, and asking Briggs to forget he'd said it. I documented the conversations, Briggs said, but I didn't escalate. Mrs. Harmon was a visible presence at the school, fundraisers, the parent advisory committee, volunteers for field trips. I told myself Reed was anxious, that the home environment was stressful but not dangerous. His voice was tight. I was wrong, and I should have acted on what he told me. I sat in that parking lot and kept my breathing steady. Why are you calling me now? Because Reed is in the hospital and I have documentation that belongs in the hands of people who can use it, Briggs said. And because I'd rather face the consequences of what I failed to do than compound it by continuing to stay quiet. I told him to send everything to Hank Lester immediately. He said it was already prepared. When I got to Hank's office and told him about the call, Hank set his pen down and looked at the ceiling briefly. A school counselor with 4 documented sessions in which the child expressed fear and the counselor failed to report. That becomes part of the evidentiary record, and it becomes part of the broader narrative about how long this went unaddressed while Renee maintained a perfect public image. Will it hurt the case? It strengthens it, Hank said. It shows a pattern of behavior sophisticated enough to deceive professionals. Renee wasn't just doing this at home. She was actively building a social presence that made her above suspicion. That's not a woman acting impulsively. That's a woman who planned this carefully over a long period of time. Fowler called again that afternoon. This time he asked outright whether Renee could avoid criminal exposure through full cooperation, full custody transfer to me, complete forfeiture of any claim to marital assets, and testimony against Vera. Hank looked at me across the table. Your call. I thought about $65,000 moved in the dark. About Reed's voice on that hillside when he couldn't tell me what day it was. About Mr. Briggs sitting on 4 documented conversations for 8 months because my wife had volunteered for enough field trips to seem like a good mother. Tell him Renee cooperates fully, I said. Full custody, full forfeiture, full testimony, and she does it in writing before the end of the week. After that, whatever the prosecutor decides, that's between them. Hank picked up his phone. I'll make the call. The evidentiary hearing was scheduled for Monday in November, 6 weeks after Reed had been airlifted off that hillside. By then, the criminal case against Vera Stanton had moved through the system with the kind of momentum that only happens when the evidence is so layered and consistent that even the defense has trouble finding a thread to pull. Renee had signed the cooperation agreement the previous Friday. Full custody transferred to me, full forfeiture of any claim to marital assets, and a formal commitment to testify against her mother in the criminal proceedings. Fowler had delivered the signed documents to Hank's office in person, which I took as a small indication of how thoroughly the situation had turned. Attorneys don't make personal deliveries when their side has leverage. The hearing itself was in 2 parts. The first part was the family court custody finalization before Judge Aldrich. The second, later that afternoon, was the preliminary criminal hearing against Vera in a different courtroom across the building. I wore the same suit I'd worn to every courthouse appearance since this began. Reed, who was now home and walking normally and had opinions about what I should wear, told me the tie was too dark. I wore it anyway. Judge Aldrich reviewed the finalized custody agreement, the full evidentiary record, and the guardian ad litem's report, which recommended sole physical and legal custody with me, supervised therapeutic visitation for Renee subject to quarterly review, and a mandatory psychological evaluation for Reed to be conducted by an independent specialist of the gal's choosing. She signed the order in under 10 minutes. Renee sat at her table and didn't look at me once. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a deep and settled quiet. The kind that comes when something that has been structurally wrong for a long time is finally corrected. The criminal preliminary hearing was a different atmosphere entirely. Vera arrived with her defense attorney, a man named Cutler, experienced and deliberate, and she sat at the defendant's table in a gray blazer with the composed expression of a woman who had decided that dignity was still available to her if she held it firmly enough. She was wrong about that, but she hadn't figured it out yet. The prosecutor, a methodical woman named Ms. Vance, walked the court through the case in chronological order. The pattern of medical visits, the thermos results, the financial transfers, the insurance correspondence Howard had photographed, the recording from Reed's iPad. When the recording played in that courtroom, Vera's composure shifted. Not dramatically. She was too controlled for that. But I watched her jaw tighten and her hands move below the table, and I knew she was hearing herself the way the rest of the room was hearing her. Methodical, calculating, running through logistics with the efficiency of a project manager while her daughter cried across the table. Then Reed testified. The court had arranged for a video deposition setup. Reed sat in a separate room with an advocate, visible to the courtroom, on a monitor. Hank had prepared him, the child advocacy team had prepared him, and his therapist had been working with him for 3 weeks. But preparation only goes so far. What came through that monitor was just a 12-year-old boy sitting straight in his chair, speaking clearly, answering every question without embellishment or drama. He described what he'd overheard on the stairs. He described the thermos and the bitter taste, and the way his legs had stopped responding on the trail. He described waking up in the hospital and understanding, in the way that kids sometimes understand things that adults talk around, that what had happened to him wasn't an accident. The courtroom was completely silent while he spoke. Cutler cross-examined carefully, probing for inconsistencies, suggesting that Reed's memory of the overheard conversation might have been shaped by subsequent events and adult conversations. Reed looked at the camera and said, with the particular flatness of someone who has thought carefully about a thing, that he remembered what he remembered because he'd lain awake in his room, replaying it until dawn, and that wasn't the kind of thing a person mixed up. Cutler had no follow-up. Judge Aldrich bound the case over for trial. Vera was remanded, pending a bail hearing the following morning. As the bailiff approached the defendant's table, Vera finally looked across the room. Not at the prosecutor, not at the judge, but at me. I held her gaze and didn't look away. Howard was waiting outside in the corridor. He'd sat in the gallery through the entire hearing. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with relief. The particular exhaustion of a person who has finally put down something very heavy. He extended his hand. I shook it. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once. "Take care of that boy." "That's the plan," I told him. Vera Stanton was denied bail 2 days after the preliminary hearing. Her attorney argued that she was 64 years old, had no prior record, and had deep community ties. The prosecutor pointed to the deliberate, sustained nature of the conduct, the financial documentation, and the fact that the primary witness against her was a 12-year-old child still in her extended family's orbit. The judge agreed that release posed an unacceptable risk. Vera went to the county detention center in a gray blazer and left without looking at anyone in the gallery. The trial itself was 4 months away. In the meantime, I had a life to rebuild, and Reed had a life to get back. We moved into a rental house in Worthington, north of Columbus, close enough to Reed's school that he could stay enrolled without disruption, and far enough from the Stanton family's neighborhood that we didn't have to think about running into anyone. It was a 3-bedroom with a decent yard and a garage. I immediately started filling with tools, a habit I'd picked up from my own father and never quite shaken. Reed came home to that house and slept 12 hours the first night. In the morning, he came downstairs and ate breakfast and asked if we could get a dog. I said we'd talk about it. He took that as a yes, which was probably accurate. His therapy continued twice a week with a specialist the GL had selected, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Keene who worked with kids coming out of high-stress family situations. Reed called their sessions the talking appointments and didn't volunteer much about what they discussed, which his therapist said was completely appropriate. What I noticed was that he laughed more easily than he had in years, and that the dark circles under his eyes gradually faded over the first few weeks. Hank wrapped up the divorce settlement in December. Because Renee had forfeited all claims under the cooperation agreement, the division was straightforward. The house was sold, the proceeds split according to the agreement's terms, and my retirement accounts remained fully intact. The $65,000 Renee had moved through hidden channels was treated as an advance against her share, reducing her settlement accordingly. Hank made sure of that. Ruth Tanner's financial work also surfaced something neither of us had expected. A separate life insurance policy on Reed that Renee had taken out 18 months earlier through the broker Vera had been corresponding with a policy I'd never known existed, naming Renee as sole beneficiary. The existence of that policy became part of the criminal evidentiary record against Vera. Howard Stanton testified at the criminal trial in March. He sat in the witness box in a dark suit and answered every question Ms. Vance put to him with the steady precision of a man who had decided that accuracy mattered more than loyalty to a marriage that had asked too much of him for too long. Renee testified as well, under the terms of her cooperation agreement. Her testimony was damaging. I suspected she knew it and had made her peace with that. Vera was convicted on 2 counts, criminal endangerment of a child and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge sentenced her to 7 years. Cutler announced an appeal. Ms. Vance said she was confident in the record. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd been in that courtroom enough. Instead, I took Reed to see his Saturday afternoon Ohio State football game. His first, something we'd been talking about doing for 2 years and kept postponing. We sat in the upper deck with hot chocolate and watched the Buckeyes win by 3 touchdowns, and Reed explained the defensive scheme to me as if I hadn't been watching football since before he was born. Driving home, Reed was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Dad, are we okay now?" I thought about what okay really meant for the two of us. Not the absence of difficulty, not a guarantee against hard things, but a foundation that was actually solid, built on what was real instead of what we'd been told to accept. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "We're okay." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to looking out the window at the highway lights. I kept both hands on the wheel and drove us home. That house in Worthington with a decent yard and the garage full of tools was waiting. Reed's history books were on the kitchen table. There was a dog adoption pamphlet on the counter that I pretended not to notice him leave there. We had work to do, the ordinary, unglamorous, day-by-day work of building a life that was actually ours. I had never looked forward to anything more in my entire adult life.